Hi, today we're talking about the 2010 version of Robin Hood, and I'm Steve. Today I'm joined by Glenn, and thank you very much for being on today, Glenn.
Oh, hey, thank you for having me on.
Why don't you just up front tell us a little bit about yourself so we can get to know you a little more?
I am a Cleveland area comedian, quote unquote. I am the co-host and founder of the Glenn and Dean Show, which is a talk show podcast. We've had an array of guests. If anyone would like to check out our work, it is on iTunes. And I am also the author of the ebook, The Dead Letters, which is available on Amazon for your reading pleasure. Not to mention, I'm a huge history nerd and a giant fan of almost all things Robin Hood.
That's interesting. How did you get into Robin Hood?
When I was a kid, before everybody had cable, we had like 12 movies maybe on VHS, of course. And one of them was the Disney classic with the animated Robin Hood with the foxes and the animals and all that. And I loved that. And then when history became a bigger part of the education structure, I had a teacher that gawked over the Kevin Costner Robin Hood, and I was like 11 or 12. And then since then, any book or movie that's been Robin Hood, I have made it a point to view and read.
And that's why we're getting into this movie, Robin Hood, today, because there is a lot of historical context to this movie. To introduce the movie a little bit, this is another Robin Hood themed movie with some significant differences. We see all the characters we've come to expect: Robin Hood, Maid Marian, Richard the Lionhearted, King John, Little John, Friar Tuck, etc., with the addition of a few new characters. This movie takes a wider lens historical approach to the classic Robin Hood story. What did you think about that background that they provided for this movie?
I thought it was interesting because they went with the classic telling of Robin, which is under King Richard and the Crusader. So at first I kind of went into it expecting the grain of salt, but then they included a lot of history from what would probably be accredited to the old tellings from like the 10th century, where it was in the Barnesdale Forest. And they did a lot of good undertones to kind of nod all from the oldest legends to the newest adaptations of the 20th century, to put them all into one, and then have at least underlying accurate history with Prince and then later King John being invaded by France and just all in all mocked as being a weak man. And I thought they did a good job of trying to keep it historically fluent and then nodding their head to all of the legend myth stuff.
Before we get into the real meat of the movie, let's look at some of the production details, courtesy of IMDb and Wikipedia. It was released in May of 2010. It was a Ridley Scott movie. Runtime of about 140 minutes, so a little long for my tastes, but probably a good length. The budget was approximately $200 million US, and it had a first weekend box office of $105 million, so not bad. It has a 43% Rotten Tomatoes from the critics, but a respectable 58% from the audience. And this movie's available for rent on all the usual streaming platforms. Glenn, what did you think about the characters and the cast? It was a pretty high-powered cast.
It was. I gotta admit, I thought some of the casting choices were a little strange, but all in all, I mean, there was nobody in the movie that couldn't act. I think my favorite cast was Mark Addy as Friar Tuck. If I had to do a criticism as far as the characters go, it's just that it's the same as any ensemble cast movie, and that none of the characters really get their fair screen time. So you have these great high-powered actors getting maybe a combined 20 minutes of screen time, with the exception of the main female and male protagonist. And I also thought it was interesting that they went with two Australian actors to play Robin Hood and Miriam.
Yeah, so we have Russell Crowe. He plays Robin Longstride. And Russell Crowe, obviously a New Zealand-born Australian actor, and he's been in Gladiator, Proof of Life, Noah, Master and Commander, L.A. Confidential, on and on and on. He's a big-time leading man. He plays Robin Hood more or less in the typical way as sort of a roguish leader of men. The exception is that he is not Sir Robert of Locksley. He's a humble-born man named Robin Longstride. How does that tie in with the classical tellings of Robin Hood?
I think it's interesting that they made him a yeoman in this one, which would stand to reason as far as, who would have that kind of longbow skill, but they still incorporated him as the classic Robin of Locksley, which I thought was kind of cool.
Yeah, I thought that it added an interesting little touch to the movie, and I think this whole movie, it's Robin Hood, but a little bit on its head. Next, we have Cate Blanchett as Marion, Maid Marian of Locksley. She's an Australian-born actress as well. Multi-Academy Award winner with the Hobbit movies and just much, much more. She plays Marion, I thought, in a pretty traditional way. How did you take her?
Yeah, I would agree with that. She's everything you expect now from, Maid Marian is what you expect. I think they called her Miriam in the movie, which was an interesting way to go because Marian would have been from the French influence, which would have already been present in the days of the Plantagenet house. But regardless, I think she did a good job and was believable enough as being the woman of action, if you will, version of Marion, and was definitely far from the damsel in distress, which I don't think I would have enjoyed it if she were portrayed as anything but. So I definitely enjoyed that they kept that part of the story, and I think that's probably more of a 20th century adaptation of it, but it's definitely one of my more favorite and preferred ones.
Then we have the lower part of the playbill, which was still pretty loaded with high-powered actors. We have Max von Sydow as Sir Walter Locksley, Robert of Locksley's dad, and he's a Swedish-born actor of many, many roles. Is there a Walter Locksley in the traditional tellings?
None that I'm really familiar with. What I got from him more than anything was when Robin returns home, it fluctuates from a close friend to a servant has been blinded by the sheriff's men seeking tax money. And that's part of what leads him, much like in the Kevin Costner version, that's kind of what leads him on his crusade. And I kind of got them making the Walter Locksley a blind, feeble old man as like a nod to that little bit.
Then William Hurt plays William the Marshal. William Hurt, American actor of many, many movies as well. Great actor. That seems to me like a new addition. William the Marshal, was he actually involved in any of these? And was he even contemporary to this time period?
As far as I can tell, he is a complete invention based on, to serve for the audience and just to make this movie flow along quicker. I would assume he's probably based on somebody historically, but nothing to do with any of the myths that I'm aware of. I mean, there's so many that I could just be missing something, but I think they just wanted to cast another high-powered guy, and I think he did a great job in the movie to kind of show a wise advisor that Little John could ignore, or that Prince John could ignore continuously.
Yeah, he played that role very well. There was a William of Marshall, but I don't know. He was in there, but to be at the peak of his career, I'm not sure exactly how that fit in, but I thought he did. They needed somebody to take that role, and he did that quite well.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say, the only thing that really baffled me was that they included so many of the merry men, but there was no Much the Miller's Son, which is another staple from like the 9th and 10th century that if I remember my research correctly.
Yeah, there was a couple of they played a kind of a minor role in the whole movie, the merry men.
Yeah, that was, I think the biggest complaint I have with the movie is that they should have named it something to more imply that it was like a prequel story. Because I feel like had there been a sequel, it would have been more merry men based. But at this point, it was just kind of like, hey, audience, they're there.
Yeah, that was one thing that I noticed with the movie is that if you don't do a lot of research before you see the movie, it doesn't hit you until after halfway into the movie that, wait a minute, this is a prequel.
Yeah, especially with the opening quote, which makes you think that you're going to jump, maybe maybe a quarter of the movie, half the movie will be explaining him prior to the outlaw, but after that it's all outlaw, and he's not really an outlaw to the last minute.
The last character is King John, and he's played by Oscar Isaac, a Guatemalan American actor. He plays an interesting version, a very rakish or carefree King John. Sort of, it's hard to explain that he's not a serious man at all.
No, I think he was played brilliantly, and based on any depiction of Prince and later King John, it seems to hit the nail on the head, though it's kind of hard to know how accurate that is, because the descriptions from his times that are still with us are just basically that he was paranoid and kept impeccable records. But based on, the classic stories, he's always been kind of a foppish, whiner that always thought he was right. I do have to say, one of my favorite characters was the woman that played his later wife, his second wife, the French woman. I thought that they did her pretty well, and just making her a very strong person, when in reality, if I had to think of a way to describe his second wife, it would be conniving. But I liked her in the movie.
Yeah, that was French actress Léa Seydoux, and she played Isabella of Angoulême. I believe that's how you say that. She was, like you said, his second wife. She came off as, initially in the movie, that she was his mistress against his good English wife. But like you said, eventually she's actually just his wife. And historically.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that made John such a unique person, especially for the royal family, was that he was willing to kind of go to the Pope and ask for help. And that's first evident when he asked for to be able to leave his first wife in an annulment. So them putting that in there is one of those.
This movie, to provide a little bit of context, it's Robin Hood and his pals in the beginning are on the way back from the Crusades with King Richard the Lionhearted. They're laying siege to a series of castles in France on their way home to England, regaining some of Richard's rebellious lands. Richard gets himself killed riding too close to the front. Robin and his gang find out about Richard's death very quickly and try to make their way home before anyone else does. On their way on the road to the coast, they run into an ambush meant for Richard, but it actually ensnares this character, Sir Robert of Locksley, who was trying to get the crown back home to England. Robert of Locksley is killed in this ambush, where Robin and his friends rescue the crown, assume the identities of the dead knights, and then use the crown as their ticket back to England. That stretches the story a little bit of Richard the Lionheart's death a little bit. What's the more of the historical angle on that?
That I'm familiar with hearing more than, repeatedly, is that he was shot by a crossbowman while they were besieging a castle, and that it was just some regular peasant or cook, perhaps. I think it was just supposed to be a regular, like a castle worker, and that Richard ordered that he not be harmed upon his death. And of course, once Richard died, they murdered the guy that shot him. But that is the only story I'm familiar with. And I read that in the historical note of Angus Donald's Robin Hood.
Yeah, I think the only thing they may have played a little bit loose is that he didn't die straight away, that they compressed that a little bit. I think he took a few days to die.
Yeah, I want to say it was like 4 or 5 days. But, it's Hollywood. Nobody wants to see a guy dying for a week.
And it helped them compress that because it made the chase scene to the coast a little bit more interesting.
Right, yeah. If he had been laying there dying for 4 days, then the ambush would have served no purpose to have not known that he was already dead. It would have been a huge plot hole. Although what does raise questions is why, when he was meeting when Godfrey was meeting with the French king, why they were speaking English, because they should have both been speaking French as their first language, you would think.
I guess that was my whole pet peevey little moment with the whole movie, is that it played a little fast and loose with the identities of Englishmen and Frenchmen, where English aristocracy, as far as I know, would have been very French, where they made them as sort of bulwarks against Frenchness.
Well, I don't know how French they would have identified themselves as, just because they would have definitely identified as Anglo-Norman, but I don't know at that point where the English identity was amongst the Anglo-Norman nobility. I would think that it's probably just easier to make them seem anti-French as opposed to just in reality being kind of selfish and being like, but these are my peasants, I'm not giving them up.
Yeah, and I think it made clear protagonists and antagonists. It wouldn't have been quite as interesting of a movie if everybody was speaking French to each other and there was no clear that we're the Anglo-Saxons fighting against this French yoke.
Yeah, we want to keep our own French yoke. You keep your French yoke across the channel. That would have been a much harder message to get across.
When I was doing a little bit of research on this movie, I saw that there was actually the movie that actually was produced in 2010 was a complete rewrite of a screenplay meant to show the Robin Hood story from the Sheriff of Nottingham's perspective. And I thought that kind of would have been an interesting twist on things. Have you ever seen any twists like that? This story from a different perspective?
I've seen versions where they include the sheriff's perspective, and I was reading about one that the BBC or BBC America was supposed to be producing, where it's through the sheriff's perspective, but he is also Robin Hood. But most of the time, it's either through Robin's perspective or Miriam's. There's obviously a couple of the more recent ones that are through fiction, where they're through Alan Adale's perspective or somebody that joins the band, but it's always one of the key outlaws or the merry men, depending on how you want to tell it. The comedic ones, though, are probably my favorite, where it's just like all a giant Mel Brooks telling of the story.
Yeah, I'd have to say that's probably one of my favorite retellings of Robin Hood, Men in Tights.
Yeah, anytime that there's a couple throughout literature, too, where they make it a point to just be like, nope, Robin's dumb, but the sheriff is just a little bit dumber. Those are probably some of my favorites, because plus anytime you look at something like that, that's a good telling of the attitude towards the either perceived or the in practice ruling classes. It's just like, oh, well, at this point, people were clearly disenfranchised with the people that considered themselves superior, and they wrote the sheriff to be a buffoon.
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Scott Rank's History Unplugged podcast and other great podcasts. Go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors. Let's take a look at some of the key scenes and see what we can pick out of and help build our background a little bit on this story and just learn a little bit more about the Robin Hood stories. Right in the beginning, you mentioned that scene of they're rebelling against their king, said by King John. And I mean, he was really mad about that. What do you make of that scene?
Yeah, that's one of those scenes where it's like, all right, from a writer's perspective and somebody that has a broad understanding of how scene building works, I understand why you would put that, because you need something to depict his personality flaws, as it were. But it's also one of those things where it's like, man, that probably did not happen. But I liked it as far as trying to just be like, John's a whiner. He doesn't get any sense of admitting that he's wrong and building from there. It's just no matter what, he's the king and you should respect that.
There was that interesting scene where Robin and the merry men, they come up on shore and they're not exactly with the crown and they're not sure exactly how they're going to be taken. They're met by the queen, the Queen Dowager, the Eleanor of Aquitaine, and still Prince John and the whole court. What did you make of that scene? Because it was a really cool scene, but I didn't know what to make of it exactly.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure if there was a point to that or if it was just to kind of show the changing of the times. Because, I mean, historically, he was coronated at Winchester like almost every other king. So they didn't put it in there for historical accuracy. And the only thing I can think of is it was kind of to show that a few people were already wise to the fact that he wasn't really Robin of Locksley. And maybe to show that John was impressionable. I'm not really sure what the decision making was with that scene there.
After that, though, Robin Hood slash now he's Robert of Locksley. He's taken on that. He's stolen his identity for the moment. They go up to the north in Nottingham. What was his motivation for that?
According to him, what he says is it's because he made a promise to the real Robin of Locksley to return the sword to its rightful owner. And, when he was taking it from Robin, he made it a point to say, I don't know anything about a father's love, which at that point in the story, you have no reason to doubt him in that theory or in that statement. And my thinking is that it's, one, he's a man of honor, and he promised the real Robin of Locksley that he was going to do that. And two, I mean, he didn't really have anything else better to do. They'd been home for a few days.
So they finally do. They get to Robert of Locksley's manor, and it's really not. I thought it was kind of run down. It wasn't what I expected. Explain that scene and describe that a little bit to us, and what was going on, and how does that connect with the Robin Hood, the classical tellings?
Well, that's all right. There's a couple parts to that. One, it being run down, I thought was a nice take because in reality, Richard had bankrupted the realm. And there's a point where John is actually yelling at his mother saying that she's as much to blame for everything that went wrong as Richard. And realistically, he's not wrong. Like, Richard bankrupted the realm. He hated England. And so he went away on war and was just obsessed with making war. And the North was always a little bit more impoverished than the South just because of the sparse population and how much more difficult it was to get crops to grow consistently. In fact, later it just became for raising sheep, which obviously didn't help the food supply any, but it was the only way the nobles could make enough money to make it worth their while. So when they came up on Locksley and it looked like a 12th century shanty town, I thought that was a pretty good depiction of what I would expect anyways. And then historically, I mean, like I said, it falls into the Richard bankrupting the realm. It's hard to go with historical tellings because he wasn't, he wasn't always Robin of Locksley. That's, I would say, probably like a 17th or an 18th century just like evolution of the story. Because when the story, during that time, Locksley wouldn't have had its own noble. It was just a small, inconsequential village, maybe a little bit bigger than a village, but it wouldn't have had anybody there of any consequence, especially as his nobility seems to grow through through every generation of telling, because there's more than one where he's the Earl of the North, and obviously that would have been reserved for the Lord of the Yorks, at that time, the House of York. But so that's kind of a tricky one. But the fact that they went out of their way to depict both the family and the town as poor, I think, are what make it, historically accurate enough to be considered a historical movie.
When he finally meets Marion / Miriam, and Robert of Locksley's dad. Robert of Locksley's dad takes it as Walter of Locksley. He takes a very practical take on it. How did he deal with this whole situation? Because he's kind of upset his son's dead, but not completely upset either.
I think for him, I mean, I'm not sure. Maybe I'm putting too much credit into it, but you would think that as a nobleman, you know, obviously you would still love your son, but pragmatism is what would have to rule your day. One, if your son's been away for a decade fighting, if he comes back alive, it's a miracle. So the fact that they come back and return the sword just kind of confirms what he already assumed. If I'm not mistaken, Russell Crowe introduces himself of Robin of Longstride, which Walter of Locksley would have known at that point that Robin Longstride had absolutely nothing stopping him from taking the role. So I think it was kind of, fortuitous, if anything. And like you said, he was pragmatic enough to jump on the situation and hoped that Russell Crowe's character Robin was at least, ready or willing to take on the role, at least for a few days, see if he liked it. And I think that he was banking on Robin being a compassionate enough man to be a fair predecessor to him, or successor, rather.
After that scene, for the next bit of the movie, they show some slices of life from the perspective of the nobles, Walter of Locksley, Miriam. And then they show some slices of life of what the village was like. Could you describe those a little bit more?
Well, the parties, I know that. I remember the village, and they showed that all of the men were pretty much gone from the village off fighting the war. And just either the only ones that were left were either too young or too old. Because there's the point where, Little John is speaking with either Will Scarlet or Alan Adale, and they said, I haven't seen this ratio since before we left. And then when they do show the inside of the manor, it's a much more, what you would consider to be a classier affair of the day. It's almost like in the Titanic, where they show the third level having a good time, and then the upper class just kind of swallowing each other's company and trying to act like they care. But I did like in the movie, I don't think they did it in that scene, but later they showed, there was mice attacking the food, and they were all talking, not but a stone's throw away. And I really liked that they did that to show that even though these are the wealthier classes and the ruling classes, their homes are still infested with vermin. They still would likely be picking fleas off of them some days. Like they're not living like a Disney princess.
Another aspect of the day-to-day life that I thought that they did really well with was when Friar Tuck takes over as the parish priest. And this is a little bit earlier in the movie, but Miriam comes to ask him for the seed corn of the church. And there's this conflict that he has with the outgoing parish priest, that there's really this divide between how the local things run and how the higher end things back in York and in the big city worked.
Yeah, I like that scene, though. If I'm being honest, I have to wonder how fair they're being to the English church, because based on the day, and it's hard to say because most of the research that gets done on the English church or the English Catholic Church and their withholding of wealth gets done under Henry VIII's time, which is obviously 3.5 centuries after this. Based on the time, they weren't as greedy as what they're always made out to be. But obviously the Catholic Church as a whole during that time, as I'm sure you well know, has the reputation of holding on to everybody's wealth and land. So I like that they do that and that they include that in the movie, especially at the local level, where in reality half of the priests were probably illiterate but cared about the people. And in this case, Friar Tuck, proves time and time again that he wants to help.
Yeah, I was wondering about that maybe even in the book tellings of the stories, if that was some anti-clericalism that was more Reformation based, that had creeped in after the Reformation. It went parish to parish of how much people liked or disliked their priest.
Yeah, absolutely. That would go, village to town and et cetera, et cetera. And Friar Tuck doesn't make his way in this telling until about the time that the story takes place. And he is, like you said, he's kind of depicted, I think, as to show the greed of the church, but he's always done as a likable character, so it's kind of hard to decipher if he's meant to show that, well, yeah, of course he's a fat friar because the Catholic Church is, fat cats, or if it's just because, well, we can make him more likable by being kind of fat and dopey.
The whole movie, it starts after that. There's really shockingly little from the Sheriff of Nottingham. What did you think? I mean, he didn't even come up really when we were discussing the cast and the characters. What did you make of his portrayal in this movie? I was a little bit shocked that he wasn't more out there.
Yeah, I mean, especially because he's almost always the classic villain of Robin Hood. But my thinking is that it falls into the same as the Merry Men, is that they were like, hey, he's here. Maybe they were planning on a sequel, though it's hard to picture Russell Crowe signing on for a sequel of anything. And that they wanted to kind of introduce him, albeit gradually, in the first, and then he would be the main villain in the second, since they focused so heavily on John and the French. But I thought it was interesting. I think his best part of the movie as a villain is when he basically told Miriam he didn't believe her when he was collecting taxes. And then, fast forward an hour and a half when Godfrey was raiding, and he goes, oh, I'm French. I'm half French on my mother's side. And that's pretty much the only thing he's in the movie to do.
Let's talk a little bit about the chemistry between Marion and Robert or Robin Hood. Can you tell us, in the traditional tellings of the story, how is their chemistry together?
I mean, again, she doesn't come into the story right away either. I would say she's she comes in about the same time as Friar Tuck. But as far as I can tell, and then I remember, she's always introduced as at least Robin's romantic interest. I think in some of the more comedic tellings, she could go either way about him. But she's, those two always are supposed to have a romantic appeal to one another. And I thought that they did, if nothing else, they did a good job of depicting that in this between Russell Crowe and Cate Blanchett of, she falters on whether she likes him or not, but there's always like an appeal and an attraction, it seems, between them, almost a tension. So I thought they did a good job of carrying out what has, for all intents and purposes, been a part of their story since the beginning.
I thought that one thing that I really liked how they put in the movie is that they really got the noble woman who's left holding the bag, and she's not sitting in the corner just waiting for her man to come home, that the women picked up the load because the tax man was still coming around to pay for these wars, and they kept everything rolling to keep these wars going.
Absolutely. I love that they did that, and I think that's always one of those bits of any story that takes place with men coming home from or going off to a war where they depict the women, for the most part, as being kind of like weak and afraid. And in reality, that wasn't an option. If you wanted to survive, you would have to be like how they have Miriam being, and in reality, or at least in what's implied reality, all of the women, because just because the men are gone, you still need to plant seeds and sow the fields.
This character, Godfrey, he comes up quite a bit. He has an Anglo-Saxon sounding name, but he's French. He's working for the French king. Is he a new character to the Robin Hood genre?
He is. I want to say that they want him to be the more classic Guy of Gisborne, and that they gave him a more Anglo-Saxon name to put it in, again, kind of a nod to the 9th and 10th century version tellings, where it would be all or almost exclusively Anglo-Saxon names. Because Guy of Gisborne, when he's introduced, it's more or less to show the yeoman and the peasant displeasure with their new Anglo-Norman masters. And I think that with the Godfrey, they wanted to take all of that, but they didn't want to be roped in with the the classic understanding and expectations that come with being Guy of Gisborne.
Oh, completely forgot about Guy of Gisborne in the book telling of it. He was a really bad guy.
Yeah, there's more than one motivation for him, but he's almost always a competing love interest of Miriam's to compete with Robin. And in some of the more brutal ones, he's just a mercenary sent there to end Robin and will stop at nothing to do it.
The whole rest of the movie, it evolves into the noblemen of the North coming together to go against the French impact and King John, but then King John and them all come together. Is that the precursor to the Barons' War?
That I believe that's what they're going for there, yeah, because it ends with them presenting him with the Magna Carta, which he refuses, which that part is accurate. I thought it was weird how they did it. They probably had blown their budget because there should have been at least a battle, but I assume that they didn't want to spend their budget on that battle when they had to do the big one of the French trying to land. And I thought it was weird because in reality, the big thing that saved John and also saved Henry VIII in later date was that the Northern Lords had a long way to go to unite. So if you could break them up, then you were theoretically going to be okay, at least for another year or two. And that's exactly what he did, but they didn't make it a point to say that's what he was doing. And then had they really emphasized that point, it would have been negated when he refuses Magna Carta because he does it in front of everybody, which I know they did it for dramatic effect, but in reality, he did that in London as cloak and dagger like as he could, so that by the time it got to everybody, they didn't have time to react, and he could keep on being King John.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors.
I thought that end scene it was powerful, and I thought that scene made the whole movie. But let's back up just a tiny bit because there's a couple of events that led up to the movie. Basically, everybody's united together because they find out that Godfrey and the King of France are launching a amphibious assault on England. I don't believe that's historically accurate, or at least not at that time, but I could be wrong about that one.
No, I think you're right. The only attack from the King of France, King Philip, at that time would have been taking back the lands that Richard had won back in France when Richard went and tried to win his Angevin lands back, which would have been, like Normandy and almost the entire coast of France, Brittany, into southern France, because John did lose all of the holdings that his brother had won, which didn't surprise anybody. I mean, Richard said that John didn't have the will to hold his land, or I think something to the effect of John will hold his land until somebody else takes it, basically saying, like, as long as there's no threat, he'll be there. But I think they were trying to, and there's, obviously there were spies, but nothing to the giant effect that was Godfrey. But I think they were just trying to show that him uniting the Northern Lords against a common foe was the only way that he could get them to fight by his side, and that he learned nothing from the whole ordeal because immediately afterwards he went back to his old tricks.
Yeah, that final scene where you think everybody's joined together and everybody's going to go skipping off into the sunset. And then he just unloads on everybody. That's why I thought that character, or the actor who played King John, he just really did a masterful role of playing a playboy who just made his own rules.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought he was one of the high points of the movie, and somebody that I didn't realize he was Guatemalan American until I did the Wikipedia IMDb, because he does such a convincing job of being an Englishman. But yeah, he does. He was fantastic, and probably in no way did it seem that he was intimidated by the star-studded cast. So I liked his depiction, and in a lot of ways, it actually did remind me a fair deal of Joaquin Phoenix's Commodus from Gladiator. So I don't know if that was a Ridley Scott approach or if that was just because the two were relatively similar in how they were portrayed in this particular instance.
Yeah, I could see that King John could be easily taken in that way, or that he was just the inept bumbler. And I think on the screen that's this over the top, conceited, almost psychopath character plays a lot better than somebody who's just a little, insecure in themselves, and they're taking on this power because of their insecurities.
Yeah, I mean, the real King John would have made for a pretty boring villain because he loved boat building. And I mean, the thing that actually made King John so hated was that the upper classes thought he was too much of a peasant, and actually thought there was a prevailing theory during his reign that a peasant had body snatched him with a witch. So, I mean, that would have been an interesting take, but I can certainly see why they went with the way they did.
Also, historically, he was the last person on Earth they ever thought that would ever become the King of England at that point.
Oh, yeah, he was the fifth son, I believe, or fourth or the fifth son, because, Richard was an unlikely king, too. He had two other brothers. And his dad had, the reason he was conquering France was because he wanted to give a kingdom to each of his sons. He was going to conquer Ireland for John, who was his favorite son, mind you. England was going to go to his oldest son, who was another Henry, if memory serves. And then I think he was going to give Richard France because he had another son die. But I want to say John was the fourth son born and the third living.
And from what I understand, he didn't receive a lot of the kingly training that others. He didn't really receive training in arms as such, and just the general training that an aristocrat would get in administration.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's the kind of experience that's impossible to give a third son. He was obviously given a top-rate education, but yeah, you can't teach somebody administration without them, one, being willing, which I don't think he ever really was, and two, being with the king the whole time, which, up until Richard came into power, John had no reason to be that close to the power. And then obviously with Richard, he was basically ruling the entire time because Richard was gone off fighting wars. But yeah, there was a big gap there where he had, where he was just completely the wrong choice for the job.
If you had to rank this movie amongst the literary version of Robin Hood, as well as some of the other movies that you've seen, how would you rank this with those other genres and media of this classic tale?
Well, first off, it's very unfair to compare any movie or TV show, even to a lesser extent, to the literary version, just because there's so much more room to work with the literary version. The one thing that you can always, or at least that I will always give them credit for, is when they do a reasonable depiction or do a fair amount of, cap nodding towards the classics of the literary versions, which this one I think probably does the best job of including classic bits of the legend, like I said, from the 9th and 10th century all the way to the later 20th century retellings of the story. This one I think does a good job of including everything, as well as having enough little grains of accurate history for people that are big history buffs to be content with. I mean, obviously, if you're somebody that's like, well, they wouldn't have had buttons, then you're not going to be happy with any historical drama ever. I would say as far as film and TV goes, though, this one comes up short of what it could have been, because they could have made this the best ever just based on the era. But I would say that it's probably top 3 or 4. I mean, it's behind Kevin Costner's, which in my opinion is the best one to date. And then after that, it just depends how much credit you want to give Errol Flynn for being Robin Hood. I would say that this trumps that one, but, there's always the movie classic lovers that'll give them the edge just based on their nostalgia.
I think that this movie all of the setting was so rich. I think they really encapsulated that era, that the castles were, you really felt that you were in these environs. And I thought that they did that really, really well. Some of the, like you said, anybody who, if you get too much into historical accuracy, oh, they wouldn't have had that kind of sword, or their shoes would have been pointy or not pointy. But I think that in the end, it did do a good melding of, it's a difficult job to do history and literary, to meld those together, plus a movie that has so many predecessors to it that you have to pay some homage to at least.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the production value is definitely one of the things that makes this movie memorable, because that is far and away what its highest grade, in my opinion, is, like you said, the castles. And I think they did a great job with the action scenes, but not relying on them. There's too many movies like this where they rely on the action and the battles to kind of carry through what's otherwise a weak plot. And this does not fall victim to that, but the production value of the battles and all of that is definitely a 2 thumbs up bit. And then, like I said earlier, the star power that comes with it is definitely something that you don't want to tilt your nose down at.
Well, I have to say that I had a great time talking to you. It was an excellent movie, and I think that we really got to the bottom of a lot of the aspects of this movie, especially that it is a difficult task to compare history with literary genres that are loosely based on history that have been evolving for about 1,000 years.
Yeah, I mean, that's no small task to undertake. And I wrote a paper about the myth of Robin Hood when I was like a sophomore in college. And just doing the research to get, a paper together took much longer than anyone expected, let alone trying to fulfill a $200 million budget movie. So I thoroughly tip my cap to all parties involved.
But that you've done so much research on it. If you had to make this movie, is there something that you would change or modify that you think would capture the legend or the literary version more?
The only thing that I would really try to do, and it's not quite a pet peeve of mine, but it's something that has bothered me more and more over the years, is I would have put him during the reign of Edward II. Because the original tellings have it, like I said, a King Edward. And of the 3 Edwards, only the second was the one that did an entire tour of his kingdom. So it stands to reason that would have been him. And for all intents and purposes, Edward II and Prince John are very similar. So you can definitely see from, a step back why it went to Richard the Lionhearted and King John as being the more famous of the monarchs that get told with the telling. But from a classic standpoint, the Edward regime would be more accurate. And plus, I just get it annoys me. And one thing I do love about this is they don't make Richard out to be a great king. Usually he's depicted as this great and honest and just king, and that's just simply not true. He was a selfish jerk who hated his country and saw it as nothing but a bankroll to fund his own projects with. So all in all, I would say that they did a good job. But yeah, if it were up to me, my change would be putting it during Edward II's reign.
Well, that's really cool. I want to thank you for coming on today. Are there any other final things you want to say about the movie?
If you have not seen the movie, please do, and do not rate Russell Crowe's accent too harshly, as that is the only real criticism I have with his depiction. But it is definitely worth watching, and ignore the 48% that Metacritic and Rotten Tomatoes gives it, because it's a much better movie than that.
Yeah, it's a very solid movie. I think it's a Netflix or it's a Saturday night and you don't have much to do and you're not sure what to watch. It's a good one to put on. It'll definitely keep your attention.
I would agree with that, yeah.